She was 21 and evicted. No family left to take her in, no apartment of her own, just a single brass propeller bolt worn smooth by 4 generations of women's hands, a folded page from her grandmother's flight log sewn into the lining of her canvas coat, and $9 bills she had earned scrubbing fish bins at a small cannery dock on the cold north end of Moosehead Lake in central Maine. And with that $9, she bought a corroded 1947 de Havilland Beaver floatplane half sunk on its pontoons at the rotting end of Mooney's Boatyard on Cove Road in the small Piscataquis County town of Greenville Junction, Maine, in a stretch of the lake that had not heard a radial engine turn over since the autumn of 1963. The faded yellow paint had blistered and silvered along the fuselage. The cargo hold door at the rear of the cabin was bolted shut with 6 rusted carriage bolts and had not been opened in 31 years. But what nobody knew, least of all Wren LaChance herself, was that bolted shut behind that rusted cargo hold door. Packed inside a hand-built cedar locker her great-grandmother had set down with her own 2 hands across the long bush-flying winters of an Alaskan and Mainer life, was something that would change her life forever. Before we go on, if you love stories like these, take a moment and subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you are listening from tonight. We love to see how far these stories travel. She had grown up with the smell of avgas and slow cold lake water, with the warm fuel-rich smell of 100 low-lead gasoline being pumped slow into a wing tank on a cool July morning, with the sharp, clean smell of fresh 40-weight aviation oil being poured into the crankcase of a 9-cylinder radial engine, with the cool old leather smell of a worn pilot's seat under a thin film of morning lake mist, with the deep, cool dusk smell of Moosehead Lake itself, breathing slow off 400 square miles of black water at the back end of a wide-open Maine evening. Old and dark and full of years. She had grown up sitting on a wooden tackle box on the long cedar plank dock at Mooney's Boatyard when she was 3 and 4 years old, watching her grandmother's long sun-weathered hands run slow down the leading edge of a fabric-covered wing, listening for the small, soft drum of a fabric repair that had begun to lift. Her grandmother was Adele LaChance, a quiet woman who had been the bush pilot at Mooney's Boatyard for 41 years. She had been the 3rd grandchild and the only one who walked the half-mile down Cove Road with her grandmother at 4 in the morning all through her growing-up years to the long cedar dock. The only one who sat on the tackle box in the cool dark before sunrise and watched her grandmother pull a worn cotton wing cover off the long yellow fabric of a wing. She had learned to read a fabric wing for fresh ribstitch lifting before she could read a book. By 8, she could pull a propeller through compression by hand without skipping a cylinder. By 12, she could read a magneto. She could stand at her grandmother's elbow at the open cowling of the 9-cylinder radial and see, before her grandmother told her, whether the left mag was firing clean or whether the points had begun to pit, whether the carburetor was running rich on a cold morning, whether the float pontoon rivets along the keel were holding tight or had begun to weep into the cold lake water. By 15, she had soloed a small 2-seat cub on floats at her grandmother's elbow on a calm August evening. By 18, she had logged 340 hours of seaplane time in her grandmother's hand-written flight log and learned every one of the 17 Moosehead linebush flying signs her grandmother said a LaChance pilot had to know before she was allowed to sign her own name in the log under her own initials. But before Wren or her grandmother, there had been Margot. Margot LaChance had come down out of the Yukon Territory in the autumn of 1946, 26 years old, with her young husband Etienne, a small canvas duffel of everything they owned, a single oilcloth-wrapped bundle holding the brass propeller bolt her own grandmother had pressed into her hand at the Dawson airfield in 1938. A small leather flight log of saved bush flying notes from a young woman's 3 years of flying the Mackenzie River mail route, and the rough plans for a small floatplane dock her father had drawn on a piece of brown butcher paper. The LaChances had ridden the train down through Saskatchewan and Quebec and into northern Maine in the early winter of 1946, and they had stopped at the small Piscataquis County crossroad town of Greenville Junction because Moosehead Lake ran 400 square miles of black bush flying water the way the Mackenzie had run, and a small cove came down off the back rise clean and cool over rounded granite, and Margot had stood at the foot of the cove on a cold November afternoon, and she had said, in the slow, careful Quebecois French English she was still learning, "This is the place. We will fly here. We will not go further." She had been 26, she had no money to speak of, and no aircraft yet, and no one in the closed-off small Maine bush-flying community who believed a young French-Canadian woman could build a working float operation on a small Piscataquis County cove with her own 2 hands. But Margot had set her hand on a fresh-cut cedar dock post, and she had begun. She and Etienne built the long cedar plank dock through the spring and summer of 1947, fitting the cedar cribbing into the cold lake bottom by hand, building a small hand-framed plank float shed at the head of the cove, and ordering a single rebuilt 1947 de Havilland Beaver on floats out of a small Quebec aircraft yard in October. Margot flew her first Moosehead bushmail run on the floats of that Beaver in November of 1947. She flew the lake for 36 winters. She trained her daughter Camille at her side, and Camille trained her own daughter Adele, and the small floatplane operation at the end of Cove Road in Greenville Junction flew its long yellow Beaver and its hand-built cedar dock without a single empty bush-flying season for 63 years, until the autumn of 1994, when the long yellow Beaver finally sank slow on its corroded pontoons in a cold October storm and was declared a total loss by the Piscataquis County aircraft assessor and bolted up in the cargo hold and tied off at the end of Mooney's dock. For 31 years. Her grandmother had 3 rules for the plane. The first was this: the lake is the pilot. You do not fly the airplane, Wren girl. The cold, black water of Moosehead Lake under the floats and the slow, steady draft of a cold August morning down off the back ridges and the long, even patience of the long cedar plank dock at sunrise fly the airplane. And you only sit in the worn pilot's seat with your hands on the yoke and your feet on the rudder pedals, and you read what the lake is telling you, and you do what it is asking. A pilot who thinks she decides when the lake is ready for the takeoff run is a pilot who will porpoise a pontoon on the second wave and lose a float into the cold water. The second was this: the airframe is the keeper. The long yellow fabric-covered wings and the 9-cylinder radial and the hand-shaped cedar floats and the worn leather pilot's seat of a working 1947 de Havilland Beaver on floats are not a machine. A pilot who thinks she keeps the family flight book in a desk drawer at home is a pilot who is fooling herself. The airframe is the keeper. The third was this: the flight log is the family. The small hand-written LaChance Bush flying notes your great-grandmother carried down out of the Yukon in 1946 have been kept in a hand-built cedar locker bolted into the rear cargo hold of the long yellow Beaver for 63 years, never once gone soft, never once gone foul. Mind the log above the other 2. Wren girl. The fabric can be redoped. The mag can be retimed. The pontoons can be re-riveted. The LaChance flight log cannot be replaced. Her grandmother died in late September of 2024 on a cool, dry afternoon in her chair on the small front porch of the small cedar-shingled cottage on Cove Road, with the open-thumbed flight log in her lap and a small thermos of cool, clean Moosehead Lake water on the side table beside her. The doctor said it had been her heart, slow and patient. Wren was 21. She did not cry. She came home from her shift at the small cannery dock and found her grandmother in the porch chair, and she sat down on the cedar porch boards beside the chair and laid her cheek against her grandmother's cool sun-weathered hand. And she stayed there until the small Greenville Junction funeral home came. She finished the last fabric repair her grandmother had been working on that night. Alone, on a small scrap of long yellow Stitz polyfiber laid out on the cedar plank dock under a small brass kerosene lantern in her own careful young hand, and only when the small scrap was set on the cool corner of the hand-framed plank float shed did she sit down beside the cold cook stove inside and finally let herself cry. The small cedar-shingled cottage on Cove Road belonged to the small Piscataquis County Bank, because her grandmother had taken a small second mortgage on it during her last sickness. And within 4 months of the funeral, the bank had come and asked Wren to be out by the 1st of February. She had left with the small brass propeller bolt her grandmother had pressed into her hand on the last clear afternoon, the folded page from the flight log sewn into the lining of her canvas coat, a small canvas duffel of her clothes, and $9 bills folded soft in the inside pocket of the coat. If these stories are reaching you tonight, take a second to subscribe. It truly does help us keep making them. And tell us in the comments, was there ever a small old craft in your family that someone tended in the cold for years on end, a plane, a boat, a workshop, that you carry with you from a woman who is no longer here? She had seen the auction notice on a hand-printed card thumbtacked to the wooden bulletin board outside the small Greenville Junction post office in soft pencil. One sealed cargo de Haviland beaver on floats, half sunk, end of Mooney's dock, $9 or best offer, see Mr. Asa Mooney at the boatyard office. She had walked the half-mile down Cove Road on a cold Tuesday morning in early February, with the snow lying thin and crusted along the road, and she had asked the man at the boatyard office for Mr. Asa Mooney by name. Mr. Asa Mooney looked up from his ledger and went very still when she said her name. "LaChance," he said slowly. "From Cove Road. You'd be Adele's grandgirl then," Wren nodded once. He walked back into a small storeroom without another word. He came back 2 minutes later with a heavy brass propeller bolt key on a piece of plain hemp twine. $9, he said. "We have been keeping this key 60 years. Your great-grandmother left it with my father back in 1947, and she told him plain, 'Hand this to whichever LaChance girl walks back down Cove Road asking after the beaver.' He laid the key in her palm. She paid him 9 soft paper dollars and signed her name. 'The plane has been waiting on you a long while, hun,' he said." She walked the half-mile back down Cove Road through the thin-crusted snow to the rotting end of Mooney's dock in the slow-gold late-morning Maine light, the small brass propeller bolt key closed in her right palm and the folded page in her jacket pocket. The cove came down off the back rise clean and cool over rounded granite along the right of the road. She found the cedar cribbing of the long plank dock first, the cribbing silvered and tilted by 31 winters of ice, and beyond the cribbing, half sunk on its corroded aluminum pontoons in the cold black water at the rotting end of the dock, the long yellow 1947 de Haviland beaver. 36 feet of fuselage, the long yellow fabric of the wings silvered and split along the leading edges. The 9-cylinder radial cowling rust dark and seized, the small hand-shaped cedar wingtips weather checked and cracking. The rear cargo hold door at the back of the cabin, bolted shut, with 6 rusted carriage bolts and a small hand-forged brass lock plate set into the door frame at hip height. 31 winters of fallen white pine needles and crusted snow banked deep against the long cedar plank dock at the door of the cabin. She did not cry. She brushed the snow and the needles from the long cedar plank dock with her boot, climbed up onto the worn cedar of the right pontoon, fitted the brass propeller bolt key into the small hand-forged brass lock plate set into the doorframe of the cabin at hip height, worked the key gently for the better part of 2 minutes until the wards remembered how to turn, and then the bolt slid back with a small dry sound, and the cabin door eased open on its corroded aluminum hinges with the slow groan of a door that had held shut for 31 years. The cool, dry breath of the cabin came out to meet her. The dim, warm leather and avgas smell of old aviation oil and worn pilot's leather, and the faint, sharp ghost of 63 years of bush-flying mornings. She stood at the cabin door a long minute. Then she lit her grandmother's small brass kerosene lantern, the one she had taken from the hand-framed plank float shed at the head of the cove, and she stepped into the cool, dim cabin. The cabin was 12 feet of slow, dim, leather-warm air, the long-worn cedar floorboards underfoot, the 2 worn leather pilot seats up front faded amber by 63 years of sun through the windscreen. The long sweep of the windscreen silvered along the lower edge by salt and weather. The small wooden instrument panel between the 2 seats with the brass-rimmed altimeter and the brass-rimmed compass still set in the panel, a small worn flight chart of Moosehead Lake folded carefully in the seat pocket of the left seat. A small hand-painted square of cream cotton cloth tacked above the pilot's window in her grandmother's careful old penmanship reading. Read the lake, mind the mag, watch the float. She walked slowly back through the cabin to the rear cargo hold door. The small brass kerosene lantern held up. The rear cargo hold door was bolted shut with 6 rusted carriage bolts. Then she remembered, very clearly, a thing her grandmother had said one summer afternoon over coffee at the kitchen table when Wren was 16. The good LeChance beavers, Wren girl. We keep what is dearest bolted shut inside a hand-built cedar locker in the rear cargo hold of the airplane itself, because aluminum holds cedar, and cedar holds paper against the cold lake damp better than any cellar in any cottage in this county, and no thief who has never pulled a propeller through compression by hand at first light on a cold August morning would think to break open the cargo hold of a half-sunk beaver and look for what a LeChance pilot has set down there. Wren found the small adjustable wrench in the seat pocket beside the flight chart, the one her grandmother had kept there for 41 years. She knelt on the cool, worn cedar floorboards in front of the rear cargo hold door. She worked the 6 rusted carriage bolts loose one by one, slow with her cold hands, the wrench turning the seized bolts the smallest fraction at a time. The 6th bolt finally turned free and dropped soft into her palm. She set the wrench down. She pulled the rear cargo hold door open slow on its corroded aluminum hinges. And inside, set into the rear cargo hold on a small cedar shelf hand fitted to the curve of the fuselage, sealed in a long dark oilcloth bundle tied with weathered hemp twine, lay the hand-built cedar locker. She lifted the locker carefully out onto the worn cedar floorboards. It was heavier than she had expected. She untied the hemp twine and opened the oilcloth fold by fold, and inside, the hand-built cedar locker, the lid carved on its top with 3 small joined letter L's, one for Margot, one for Camille, one for Adele. She lifted the lid, and inside, packed in a thin bed of dry cedar shavings, lay the things. A heavy worn oilskin-bound flight log, the cover soft with 63 years of bush-flying hands, the linen-stitched pages of cotton paper hand-cut and hand-ruled, and on every page, in the careful old hands of 3 generations of LeChance pilots, was the whole record of the airplane and the lake, the wind across the cove on a given August morning, the mag pass, the compression check, the fabric repair, the float rivet seal, the Bushmail run, the bear and the moose sighted from the air, page after page after page, 63 years of careful Moosehead line-keeping. Beneath the flight log, in the cool cedar dark of the locker, lay a small leather pouch. She lifted it. Inside the small leather pouch lay 19 small American gold coins, $5 pieces from the 1870s and 80s, the gold Margot had carried down out of the Yukon in the canvas duffel in 1946. And folded into the back of the flight log, sealed with a drop of dark pine pitch, gone hard as amber, was a single letter, the wax still whole, addressed in long, careful old Quebecois French-tinged penmanship to the granddaughter who comes back. From Margot Lachance, bush pilot, Greenville Junction, Maine, 1947. She broke the seal slow with her thumb, and she read the letter aloud to the cool, dim cabin, because there was no one else to read it to. And the long yellow wings of the beaver in the cold black water of the cove were the only thing listening. To the granddaughter who comes back. If you are reading this, you have walked down Cove Road with a key in your hand, and you have brushed the white pine needles from the long cedar plank dock, and you have turned the bolt. And you have lit a lantern in the cabin, and you have known to break open the rear cargo hold and lift the cedar locker out onto the floorboards, and you are a Lachance pilot, and the lake has called you home. My name is Margot Lachance. I was born Margot Tremblay on a small Quebecois homestead north of Lac-Saint-Jean in 1920. The eldest of 4 daughters and the only one my own grandmother taught the propeller and the float and the cold lake, because I was the only one who would sit still long enough to learn to listen to the small soft drum of a fabric repair that had begun to lift. I came down out of the Yukon with my Etienne in the autumn of 1946, and we rode the train down through Saskatchewan and Quebec and into northern Maine in the early winter. And I stood at the foot of this cove on a cold November afternoon, and I knew, the way a woman knows a thing once and keeps it for 40 years, that the lake was here. The flight log in the locker below this letter, granddaughter, is not money. It is not gold. It is the family. The fabric can be redoped, the mag can be retimed, the pontoons can be re-riveted, by your own hand and a careful Greenville Junction mechanic. The Lachance flight log, kept in cedar and oilskin against the slow cold lake damp, is the family kept in cedar and the slow dim dark of the rear cargo hold. The gold in the pouch is the small gold I carried down out of the Yukon in the canvas duffel, and I trust you will not spend it for any reason other than to mend this airframe, or re-rivet these pontoons, or buy a fresh roll of long yellow Stitz polyfiber from a small Greenville Junction supplier in a year your own fabric runs thin. Do not move the flight log. Do not unbolt the locker again unless you mean to fly. Read the log slow, one entry at a time, in the long cold evenings, and copy the working notes by hand into a fresh book of your own making. And then, only then, sign your own name in the log under your own initials and fly the beaver out of the cove on a clear August morning the way a Lachance pilot has flown the cove for 63 years. With my whole hand and my whole heart, Margot Lachance, bush pilot, Greenville Junction, Piscataquis County, Maine, the 14th of November, 1947. Wren laid the letter flat on the worn cedar floorboards of the cabin. She set her open palm across it. She did not cry. She closed her eyes and breathed in the cool leather and avga smell of the cabin and the faint, sharp ghost of 63 years of bush-flying mornings, and the tight thing that had lived in her chest since the cool September afternoon she had walked onto her grandmother's porch and found her quiet in the chair, loosened. The name of the loosening was home. She drove the gold pieces down to a careful coin dealer in Bangor the following Tuesday, a man named Mr. Bertram Voorhees, who valued the 19 small $5 gold pieces at $42,800. She sold 6 of them. She put $14,000 in a savings account at the small Greenville Junction Bank. and she walked back down Cove Road with a fresh roll of long yellow Stitz polyfiber for the wing fabric, a small can of fresh aviation dope, a fresh set of mag points, a small bundle of cedar shake for the dock, a coil of new oakum for the pontoon rivets, and the careful written estimate of an honest Greenville Junction aircraft mechanic named Mr. Theodore Janssen for the rebuilding of the corroded pontoons and the retiming of the 9-cylinder radial, $21,400, work to begin in the spring. She did not move the flight log. The flight log stayed where Margot and Camille and Adele had set it, in the cool cedar dark of the locker on the small cedar shelf in the rear cargo hold of the Long Yellow Beaver. In the early spring, when news that there was a LaChance pilot back at Mooney's dock had walked up and down Cove Road the way news has walked up and down the Cove since the first cedar piling was driven, the older bush pilots of 3 Piscataquis County towns began to drive down the road in their old pickup trucks and stand quiet at the head of the dock and not say much at all. One of them brought a small bundle of fresh aviation oil for the rebuild and laid it beside the float shed. One of them, a man in his 80s named Mr. Obadiah Eberly from the Rockwood Floatplane Base, who turned out to have apprenticed under her grandmother's mother Camille in 1963, brought a small folded handwritten paper and laid it on the cedar dock. On the paper was a list of every working bush pilot still flying Moosehead Lake in 1994, every name, every base, every fate. Mooney's dock was the only one still standing. We had begun to wonder, Mr. Eberly said, very quietly, if the whole Moosehead bush flying line had finished forgetting. That is the thing about the bush flying our grandmothers teach us. The slow kind. The kind we learn on a tackle box at the long cedar plank dock under a small brass kerosene lantern when we are 3 years old. It is not really about the airplane. The airplane is the wage. The lake is the trade. The trade is the cold, black water of Moosehead Lake under the floats at first light on a cold August morning, and the small, soft drum of a fabric repair that has just begun to lift, and the worn oilskin-bound flight log kept in cedar and oilskin in the rear cargo hold of a half-sunk Beaver for 63 years. The trade is, above all, the truth Margot wrote in her letter on the 14th of November, 1947. The flight log is the family. The airframe is the keeper. The lake is the pilot. We are only the granddaughters who walk back down Cove Road with a key in our hand and break open the cargo hold and read the log slow. Wren LaChance was 21 years old and evicted. She had $9 to her name, and she spent them on a corroded 1947 de Havilland Beaver half sunk on its pontoons at the rotting end of Mooney's dock on Cove Road in Greenville Junction, Maine. It was the best $9 she ever spent. If this story has kept you company tonight, thank you for sitting up with us. Sleep well, breathe easy, and see you in the last warm light of the day.